It was the first Sunday of the month, youth celebration service, and the cathedral had never looked more beautiful. Golden sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting long rainbow streaks across polished floors. The choir rehearsed in the background, voices rising in layers like heaven was listening in. Everyone wore their best. Laced hats, gold cufflinks, imported shoes. The elders lined the front row, seated with reverence and silent pride. Church was not just worship here, it was social currency. Which is why when a girl walked in barefoot, people noticed. Not because she was loud, not because she made a scene, but because she didn't. She slipped quietly through the side entrance, clutching a worn-out hymn book to her chest like it was armor. Her dress was faded, neatly pressed, but clearly handed down through several children before her. Her hair was in braids, tight and tidy. Someone had taken time, even if they had no money. She kept her head down, eyes forward. To the untrained observer, she looked out of place. But if anyone had truly looked, they might have seen something far more extraordinary. Pain, determination, and something even rarer, dignity without bitterness. She sat at the back, second to last pew, not to be unseen, not to hide, but to not disturb. The service hadn't started yet, but whispers had. Is that girl not wearing shoes? Where is she from? Does she know who's coming today? Someone should ask her to wait outside. The organ played louder, as if trying to drown judgment with music. The girl heard them. She just didn't flinch. She opened the hymn book and began to read. Page 147. Lead Kindly Light. At the front of the church, the senior pastor straightened his robe. Outside, a black SUV pulled up, then another. Then another. The billionaire had arrived. He was not a local, not a regular. He was the reason the media vans were parked outside and the church cameras had been upgraded last week. Victor Delane. Tech mogul. Global philanthropist. Quiet face of millions in charity funding. He walked in like he had built the building himself. Calm. Measured. Understated elegance. Navy suit. Gray beard. No jewelry. Just presence. He took the third row from the front, the seat reserved for dignitaries. His assistant whispered something in his ear, pointing discreetly to the far back. He turned briefly, eyes scanning past countless faces. He saw her, the barefoot girl, still reading. And for a moment, he just watched her. Then he looked away. The opening prayer began. The choir swayed. The preacher welcomed the congregation. But in that first 30 minutes, not a single camera crew caught what really mattered. The barefoot girl hadn't moved an inch, but her presence shifted the entire atmosphere. The girl's name was Adiz. But nobody here knew that yet. She had walked 5 kilometers to get here, from a village that didn't even appear on Google Maps. She had woken up before sunrise, tied her shoestring sandals with wires the night before, but they had snapped halfway. So she came barefoot. The road was dry and filled with thorns. She had cleaned her feet in the stream outside the church gate before stepping in. It didn't matter. Her toes still told the truth. Bruised, bleeding slightly, covered by grace and silence. She came not for the billionaire, not for the pastor, not even for the service. She came for one thing only, the altar. She had something to lay down. Not money, not offering, something heavier. Her mother had told her, if you have nothing else to give, give God your walk. Walk until he answers. So she walked through ridicule, walked past judgment, walked through pain, and sat quietly, holding on to faith like a child holds onto a kite string in a storm. Nobody in the crowd knew her name, but heaven had been watching her since dawn. The preacher was halfway through his sermon now. He was dynamic, funny, persuasive, a storyteller. But somewhere between the third joke and the second applause, his voice wavered. He looked to the left, then to the right, then at the girl. She hadn't blinked. He paused. I feel like we are forgetting something, he said. The crowd chuckled awkwardly. He continued, slowly. We've dressed up well today. We've come expecting miracles. But I wonder, what if the miracle is already here, just not dressed the way we imagined? You could feel it, the air shifting. Eyes turned to the back. She looked up for the first time. Just once. And in that look, you could see her whole life. Victor Delane stood up. The pastor hadn't called him. The service was not at his segment. The cameras scrambled. Ushers looked confused. The media team whispered into headsets. He walked up to the pulpit slowly. No words at first. Then he turned toward the congregation, not the cameras. His voice was calm. I've seen poverty. I've seen pain. But rarely have I seen someone carry both with such grace. He looked at her directly. Please, young lady, what is your name? The room was frozen. She stood slowly, nervous, but not afraid. Adiz, sir. He smiled. Would you come forward, Adiz? The choir gasped. The elders sat up straight. Some women whispered, she can't walk up there barefoot. But she could. And she did. Every step across that marble floor felt like thunder in heaven's ears. Victor knelt, removed his own shoes. Fine leather, handmade in Italy. He placed them in front of her. These are not to cover your feet, he said. They're to honor the walk you already made barefoot. Then he stood, looked at the pastor. Forgive me, Reverend, but today's offering should be about her. The crowd rose, applauding. Some crying, some repenting. The moment was holy. But it didn't end there. The applause slowly quieted, but not because the moment passed. It was because something sacred was settling in. The billionaire hadn't moved. He stood by Adiz, silent now. The cameras zoomed, trying to capture something that couldn't quite be recorded, not with pixels, not with light. The pastor returned to the pulpit, eyes glassy. Church, sometimes we don't know we've been blind until God sends us someone who walks barefoot right past our pride. He turned to Adise, voice softer now. Child, what brought you here? She hesitated. The crowd leaned in. I heard, she began, that today there would be testimonies of answered prayers. Pause. And I needed to lay mine down, even if it hasn't been answered yet. The pastor blinked. What was your prayer? She looked up, then out at the congregation, no longer nervous, just honest. That my mother will walk again. She had a stroke. We live far. We don't have much. But I wanted to put her name at the altar today because I promised her, and promises are heavier than shoes. No one moved. You could hear someone sob in the third row. Victor turned to the pastor. I would like to donate on behalf of Adiz's mother, a full treatment, in any country she needs. transport, housing, support, everything. Today, let's answer her prayer. The church erupted. The cameras caught the pastor whispering, "My God," under his breath. The pianist tried to play something, anything, but his hands were trembling. Odyssey stood quietly, still holding her hymn book, still barefoot. She hadn't cried. Not yet. After the service ended, people flooded toward the dais, hands outstretched, tears flowing, apologies on their lips. But she didn't look overwhelmed. She looked peaceful. Victor asked to speak with her privately. They sat in the pastor's study. No cameras, no script, just truth. "Do you know why I cried, Adis?" he asked. She shook her head gently. "I've spent half my life giving away money, building schools, sending donations, but it always felt controlled, strategic, calculated. Today, when you walked in with nothing and still carried more presents than a room of millionaires, I realized I've been missing the real altar all along." He paused. "My mother used to walk barefoot to school in Ghana. She never let me forget that. She died before I became successful. But today, when you walked in, I swear I saw her face." Adiz blinked. That's when she finally cried. It was days later. Victor returned to her village with a medical team, his foundation, and 2 documentary filmmakers, not for publicity, but to learn. They found Adis's mother, thin, paralyzed on one side, speaking only in faint whispers. But the room, it was clean. There were scriptures hand-painted on the walls. There were sandals by the door, none of them whole. Victor sat beside her. "We've come to walk with you now, ma'am. Your daughter, she changed something in all of us." She smiled through tears. "God knew I could not walk," she said softly, "so he borrowed my daughter's feet." A week later, the story exploded across social media, not because Victor posted it, but because a member of the church leaked a video clip of the altar moment. The comments were filled with, "I don't believe in God, but this made me cry. That girl just healed something in me. Why does this feel more holy than anything I've seen online in months?" She walked in barefoot and left everyone else speechless. Victor released a statement later. "I met God again in a barefoot girl. Her name is Adis. I don't think we lifted her up. I think she came to lift us." The video reached 10 million views in 4 days. But Adiz stayed quiet. She still lived in her village. Her mother was receiving treatment. She was offered scholarships, sponsorships, even influencer deals. She declined most. Except one. Victor had quietly asked her, "Would you like to travel the world and speak to young girls like you? You wouldn't have to wear shoes unless you want to." She smiled. "I'd like that. But if I speak, can I read from my hymn book?" He laughed. "Read it all. The world needs to hear it again." The next Sunday, the church was different. Not just in the way people dressed, though that had shifted too. Expensive shoes were still worn, but now with awareness. Women adjusted their hats not in pride, but in humility. Ushers no longer looked past the quiet ones in the back. They had learned something unspoken. The pastor stepped up to the pulpit, his Bible in hand. But instead of a sermon, he told a story. He told them about the barefoot girl who came with nothing but left everyone with something more valuable than gold. He paused, looked around the room. "I don't know what kind of prayers you carried in today," he said, voice firm but warm. "But understand this. God hears prayers carried on wounded feet just as loudly as those spoken in tongues." No one clapped. No one shouted. They simply listened. Something deeper than emotion had entered the room. Reverence. The church established a new tradition that day, the foot offering. Once a month, congregants were encouraged to write the names of people they were praying for and walk those names physically to the altar. It didn't matter if you had shoes. What mattered was that you walked with purpose. It was named in her honor. The Adiz Walk. 6 weeks later, Victor invited Adiz to speak at a youth conference in South Africa. At first, she declined. "I'm not a speaker," she said softly. Victor replied, "You weren't a symbol either until you became one." So she agreed. When she stepped onto that stage in front of 2,000 teenagers from all over Africa, she didn't wear fancy clothes. She wore the same braids, a simple dress, and yes, no shoes. She walked slowly to the center, then opened her hymn book. "I won't say much," she began, "but I will tell you what I told myself the day I walked into church barefoot." She paused. "Even if no one notices, heaven sees every step." Silence. Then a rising tide of applause, soft at first, then thunderous. She closed with one sentence that became the conference's slogan. "When your path hurts your feet, it's probably leading somewhere holy." That night, 17 youth groups launched walking prayer circles in their own communities. Months passed. As his mother recovered slowly, regaining speech, then strength. Adiz continued her education, fully funded. Victor kept his promise, but he didn't just pay for one girl. He started a Barefoot fund that quietly funded surgeries, scholarships, and support for young girls across rural Africa. But the most powerful part wasn't money. It was the shoes. Every year on the anniversary of Adiz's first walk, hundreds of young women began sending in a pair of old shoes, ones they had outgrown or ones they wore during the hardest parts of their lives. Each pair came with a letter. "These shoes carried me through depression. These shoes walked me away from abuse. These shoes remind me I survived." Victor built a small memorial room beside the church. He called it the Sanctuary of Souls. No lights, just one altar, and hundreds of worn-out shoes, each carrying a story only heaven could fully understand. 3 years later, Adiz received a letter from a girl in northern Nigeria. Her name was Miriam. She had seen the video, and she had walked 15 kilometers to find the nearest church, barefoot. She wrote, "I didn't have an offering, but I had pain. I didn't have money, but I had movement. I didn't know God, but I took one step and whispered, 'If you see me, take one more step for me.' And now, I believe he did." Adiz folded the letter and wept. Not because it was dramatic, but because she knew exactly what that moment felt like. And because it reminded her of the vow she made years ago to never let a single walk go unseen. The marble floor was still the same. Smooth, cold, echo-prone. It had been 3 years since Adiz first walked across it barefoot. Now, 100 girls did the same every month. Some carried tears. Some carried notes. Some just carried silence. But all of them carried courage. The church had expanded. New wings, more staff, a youth training center named in her honor. But none of it, not one brick, compared to what Adiz built with no shoes, no title, and no microphone. Victor stood beside the pastor that Sunday, older now, walking with a cane. He watched the girls line up for the foot offering. He whispered to the pastor, "This is better than all the cathedrals I've built." The pastor nodded, "And more holy than half of them." After a youth leadership retreat, a girl approached Adis during lunch. She was 12, small, bright eyes, torn shoes. "Miss Addis," she said quietly, "I have a question." Adis smiled. "Anything. Do you ever wish you wore shoes that first day?" Adis paused. A long silence passed. Then she leaned in. "If I wore shoes that day," she said, "maybe no one would have seen what was actually broken." Ruth blinked. "But didn't it hurt?" Adis nodded. "Yes, but it hurt up, not down." That night, Ruth donated her shoes at the altar. The note inside read, "For the girl who might walk after me." The world began to notice. News outlets did features. Documentaries were filmed. Not just about Victor or the church, but about the walk. Addis didn't seek fame, but it found her. A publishing house asked her to write a book. She titled it, "The Altar Follows You." It wasn't about religion. It was about movement. About how sometimes your prayer isn't answered in words, but in steps. The book hit #1 in several countries. Not for how it sounded, but for how it made people feel. One afternoon, she visited a remote village. The church had no doors. The floor was dusty. But 42 girls sat cross-legged in front of her, listening. A little girl came up with a pair of broken sandals. She held them out with shaking hands. "These were my mother's," she said. "She died last year. She told me to never walk in anger. I want you to have them." Adis took the shoes, knelt in front of the child, and kissed her forehead. That night, she placed the sandals in a velvet box beside her hymn book. She didn't cry that time. She worshipped. Victor's health declined. Doctors warned him of a final stroke risk. He told his assistant, "If I die anywhere, I want it to be there, at the church where I saw God again." They wheeled him in during the foot offering that Sunday. As the choir sang, Victor closed his eyes and whispered something barely audible. Adis stepped up beside him. He looked at her one last time and smiled. Not at her face, but at her feet. Still bare. Still holy. He passed quietly, just as the final hymn reached its last verse. The entire church wept, but it wasn't grief. It was gratitude. 5 years after it all began, Addis was asked to speak at a global summit on youth leadership. They asked her to come in formal dress. She agreed. But when she walked on stage, she removed her shoes. The room of world leaders, influencers, and CEOs fell silent. "I am not here today because I was invited," she began. "I am here because I walked." Pause. "I walked into a place that wasn't ready to see me, but God was already waiting." She held up her old hymn book. "This is the only resume I carried, and it still works." People wept, and then stood. A standing ovation for someone who never asked for a platform, only a place to kneel. Late one night, long after the cameras stopped visiting, Adis wrote in her journal, "They thought I needed shoes to walk, but I needed a reason to keep moving." Sometimes, faith is the blister you get from believing on hard ground. She closed the book and smiled, because she knew the real altar had never been at the front of a church. It had always been wherever someone took one brave step forward, even when it hurt. Maybe you're hearing this story and thinking, I'm not strong like her, but maybe you are. Maybe you've been walking in silence. Maybe your shoes are worn, or maybe your heart is. But listen, heaven sees every step, not just the loud ones, not just the perfect ones. Every step toward hope, every step away from pain, every step that says, I don't have it all figured out, but I'm moving anyway. That's the kind of step that shakes the earth. So here's your altar. Right here, right now. You don't need permission. You just need movement. And if your feet hurt today, that might just mean